They were sent in last, and usually didn't come back. On the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, the U.S. Marines had no choice but to deploy the most terrifying weapon in their arsenal, flamethrowers. But while they could clear bunkers and caves, the men carrying them paid the ultimate price. Most didn't survive longer than 4 minutes. This isn't just the story of a weapon, it's the story of hell on Earth, and the men who stepped into it willingly. Recently declassified records and survivor accounts reveal what really happened when fire met stone on the bloodiest island of the Pacific War. Before we talk about fire, we need to talk about stone. Iwo Jima wasn't just any piece of land, it was a black, jagged scar in the Pacific Ocean. Barely 8 square miles of volcanic rock, steaming with sulfur, wind-blasted and dead. There were no trees, no rivers, no shelter. But to the U.S. military, this island was priceless. Located exactly halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland, it sat along the critical air path that B-29 Superfortress bombers flew during bombing runs on Japan. If America could take it, they'd gain a desperately needed emergency landing site and a launch point for fighters to escort bombers. But if they failed, it would become a graveyard. The Japanese command saw this coming months in advance, and what they did to prepare defied all logic. Under orders from General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, they didn't simply dig trenches, they transformed the island into a death trap. They carved over 11 miles of tunnels through the island's core. Command bunkers, mortar nests, machine gun pillboxes, and supply stations were buried into the mountainside, reinforced with steel and concrete, and hidden so well even aerial reconnaissance couldn't detect them. The objective was simple: bleed the Americans until they broke. Kuribayashi, unlike other Japanese generals, knew the Americans would eventually win. But he was determined to make them pay so heavily for every inch that the U.S. might think twice about invading Japan itself. His strategy was to delay, ambush, and sacrifice. There would be no last-ditch charges, no suicidal banzai screams, just silence, traps, and death from below. And so by the time American Marines landed in February 1945, they weren't walking onto an island. They were walking into a volcano designed to kill them slowly. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the U.S. unleashed one of the heaviest pre-invasion bombardments of the war. Naval guns pounded the island for days, while bomber planes dropped tons of explosives, cratering the earth and painting the sky with fire. But what they didn't realize was they were bombing ghosts. Most of the Japanese soldiers weren't in trenches or visible bunkers. They were deep underground, untouched, and waiting. Then came the landing. Waves of Higgins boats dropped thousands of Marines onto the black shores. But this beach wasn't like the ones in Normandy. The sand was volcanic ash, fine, soft, and sticky. It swallowed boots, jammed tank treads, and slowed movement to a crawl. There were no trees to hide behind, no rocks for cover. Just flat blackness and sky. At first, the silence was eerie. For over an hour, there was no gunfire. Some Marines thought the bombardment had worked. Others were more suspicious. And then, just as the beach was full, it started. From hidden pillboxes and camouflaged slopes, the Japanese opened fire with everything they had. Pre-sighted artillery exploded in the surf. Machine guns raked across the sand. Mortars landed among the landing craft. Within minutes, chaos replaced confidence. Bodies fell faster than medics could respond. Radios crackled with confusion. Vehicles burned. The first Marines who'd landed were still trying to climb up the beach slope. And now they were being joined by fresh waves, all of them sitting ducks. What the Japanese had done was ingenious and brutal. They let the enemy come in fully, get comfortable, and then cut off their escape. Kuribayashi's forces weren't aiming to hold the beach. They wanted to turn it into a killing field. And it worked. Even when Marines managed to push inland, they found themselves in a nightmarish landscape of craters, tunnels, and death that didn't follow the rules of warfare. There were no front lines. You could clear an enemy pillbox, only to have them reappear from behind. That's when American commanders realized traditional weapons wouldn't win this fight. The deeper the Marines pushed into Iwo Jima, the stranger and deadlier the fight became. There were no safe zones, no clear enemy lines. The Japanese had built a fortress inside the island itself, and the most terrifying part of that fortress were the pillboxes. These weren't just concrete bunkers, they were masterpieces of death. Each one was reinforced to survive direct hits from tanks and naval guns. Their entrances were hidden behind rocks, angled to avoid being hit. Their gun ports were camouflaged and overlapping, meaning each pillbox could cover the next. A Marine couldn't just charge one. If he did, he'd get cut down by another he hadn't even seen. What made them worse was what lay beneath. Almost all of the pillboxes were connected by subterranean tunnels. You could destroy a bunker with grenades or explosives and move on, only for the Japanese to sneak back into it later and ambush you from behind. The Marines weren't just fighting forward, they were fighting ghosts behind them, beside them, even underneath them. Grenades, rifle fire, and satchel charges only work if someone could get close enough. But getting close meant crawling over open ground under machine gun fire. And even if you reached the pillbox, the zigzag interior often absorbed the blast, sparing the defenders inside. It was a war of inches. And it was tearing the Marines apart. Then, someone brought up an old, nearly forgotten weapon, the flamethrower. It wasn't new technology. Flamethrowers had existed in World War I, but on Iwo Jima, they became the only solution. Fire didn't care about zigzag walls or oxygen levels. It didn't bounce off reinforced doors. It flooded every space, robbed men of air, and made hiding impossible. The Marines began strapping fire to their backs and sending men into hell armed with nothing but a pistol and a flame. But what the flamethrower could do to the enemy was just the beginning. The real darkness would come when we saw what it did to the men who used it. The first American flamethrowers to hit the beaches at Iwo Jima were using the M2 flamethrower, a beast of a weapon that demanded both strength and madness to operate. Fully loaded, it weighed around 70 pounds, with 2 heavy fuel tanks and a central nitrogen propellant tank strapped across the operator's back like a bomb waiting for a spark. The tanks were filled with a thickened mix of gasoline and diesel, a jelly that stuck to anything it touched and kept burning. The nozzle, held like a rifle, had a small white phosphorus igniter at the tip. When the operator pulled the trigger, it unleashed a roaring stream of flame up to 30 yards away. For just 10 seconds total. 10 seconds. That was the difference between life and death. Every operator knew you had one chance, one breath of fire before your weapon ran dry, and you became the most hunted man on the battlefield. Because make no mistake, if the Japanese saw you, they would try to kill you first. The flamethrower wasn't just another weapon. It was the most feared and hated weapon on Iwo Jima. From the moment it spat fire, every enemy rifle, grenade, and mortar zeroed in on its operator. Japanese soldiers called them demons, and their commanders issued direct orders to eliminate them at any cost. Flamethrower operators were often ambushed, shot on sight, or worse, captured. That, more than anything, terrified them. One Marine later recounted watching a fellow flamethrower trooper charge a cave, aim his weapon and have it misfire. Before he could retreat, 2 Japanese soldiers grabbed him and pulled him into the darkness. For 2 days, Marines nearby heard his screams. Then they stopped. There was no rescue. That's why flamethrower men often begged their squad mates to shoot them if they ever got captured. They knew what would happen. And even if they survived, many never talked about what they'd seen. The sound, the smell, the memory of what fire did to human beings in enclosed spaces. Carrying that burden, literally and mentally, broke men. Even those who survived the war came home with nightmares that never left. The flamethrower wasn't just terrifying because of what it could do, it was terrifying because it forced a new kind of moral reckoning. You weren't shooting someone from 300 yards. You were burning them alive at 30 feet. And while most flamethrower operators said they were simply doing their duty, many also admitted, years later, that they never truly came to peace with it. The M2 didn't just shoot fire. It created an inferno that reached over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside caves and pillboxes, it vaporized the air. It consumed all oxygen. In seconds, the heat and lack of breathable air caused near-instant collapse. Some post-war medical studies claimed victims likely lost consciousness before feeling pain. Others weren't so sure. But to the men who used it, it never felt clean. It never felt right. One operator described the moment he cleared a pillbox with fire. When he climbed inside after the smoke cleared, what he saw made him vomit. He sat outside in silence for an hour before his commanding officer ordered him back into action. There was no time for emotions, no space for guilt. And then there were the tanks themselves, highly flammable, heavily targeted. Some Marines thought a single bullet would cause the tanks to explode in a fireball. That wasn't entirely true. The fuel was pressurized, not rigged like a bomb, but it didn't matter. Just the idea that one misstep could turn you into a human torch was enough to haunt every step. The real horror was psychological. Flamethrower operators, after witnessing what their weapon did, often refused to use it again. They begged to be reassigned. Some threw up before missions. Others confessed decades later they never told their families what they had done. The flamethrower worked. It saved lives by ending impossible standoffs. But it also broke the men who used it. And when the Marines realized they were losing operators faster than they could replace them, they turned to something even more terrifying than a man with a flame strapped to his back. The answer to the carnage wasn't more men, it was more metal. As the casualty rate for flamethrower operators soared past 90%, commanders made a chilling but effective decision. Put the flame inside a tank. The result was the M4A3R3 Sherman, a standard medium tank modified to replace its main gun with a flamethrower. It became known as the Flame Sherman. And when it arrived on Iwo Jima, everything changed. Where the backpack M2 could shoot 30 yards, the Flame Sherman had a range of nearly 100 yards. Where a Marine had 10 seconds of fire, the tank carried 300 gallons of fuel, delivering multiple bursts across an entire battlefield. And most importantly, it had armor. It could get close to bunkers and caves without being shredded by machine gun fire. But that armor wasn't invincible. Iwo Jima's terrain was soft volcanic ash that bogged down treads and made easy targets. The Japanese knew that if they could take out the flame tank, they might turn the tide of a battle. And so, every Flame Sherman became a target the second it opened fire. Suicide charges, hidden mines, explosive traps. These tanks were priority kills. Their crews, often trapped inside for hours, risked being incinerated in a second if the wrong shell hit the right spot. But they went forward anyway. Tank crews coordinated with infantry who provided cover fire. Regular Shermans flanked them for support. The flame Shermans would roll up to the front line, angle toward a tunnel entrance or bunker, and unleash a torrent of fire so intense it melted steel and glass. Their psychological impact was devastating. Entire enemy positions surrendered at the sight of them. Others simply fled into the smoke. Some Marines described it as watching hell break open. And yet, for all the horror, they worked. Without them, the island might have never been taken. And for one Marine, Herschel Woody Williams, his mission with the Flamethrower would become the stuff of legend. February 23, 1945, the same day the iconic flag was raised over Mount Suribachi, a different battle was raging below the mountain, where the terrain didn't offer hope or symbolism, just death. That's where Herschel Woody Williams, a quiet Marine from West Virginia, was handed what many called a suicide mission: destroy a series of pillboxes that had pinned down his entire company. Multiple Marines had already been killed trying. No one wanted the job. Woody said yes, with 4 fellow Marines assigned to cover him, 2 of whom would die within minutes. Woody began crawling across the volcanic ash, flamethrower strapped to his back, under withering machine gun fire. His target, concrete bunkers fortified with steel and rage. The Japanese had dug them in deep and positioned them to create overlapping kill zones. Any approach was met with immediate, coordinated bursts of fire. But Woody moved with a strange calm, ducking behind ridges and shell craters, choosing his moments. He snuck up on the first pillbox, found a narrow slit near the air vent, and shoved the nozzle in. Then he pulled the trigger. A blast of fire tore through the bunker, followed by screams and then silence. He didn't pause. Woody turned and moved toward the next, then the next. In between assaults, he sprinted back to the rear line to grab another fully loaded flamethrower, as the fuel on each M2 only lasted seconds. By the end of his run, he'd cleared 7 enemy positions, single-handedly. One Japanese soldier charged him with a bayonet. Woody turned, fired a jet of flame, and stopped the attack in its tracks. He was relentless, focused, mechanical. Some would later say he moved like he was already dead, like nothing could touch him. When the dust settled, the Americans advanced because of him. What made Woody different wasn't his strength. It was his calmness under fire and refusal to let fear paralyze him. He didn't brag. He didn't break. And when the war ended, Woody didn't think of himself as a hero. He couldn't forget what he saw, or what his weapon did. But the Marines never forgot him. Woody Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the only flamethrower operator in World War II to receive that distinction. His story became legend, but the truth behind that medal was far more haunting than heroic. Woody Williams lived until 2022, passing away at the age of 98. But even in his final years, the memories of Iwo Jima lingered just beneath the surface. In interviews, he admitted he couldn't remember much of the actual battle. Likely a defense mechanism, a way for his mind to protect itself. What he did remember were the faces of the Marines who didn't come back, the friends who had laid down their lives to give him just a few more seconds, the ones whose names were etched in stone while he walked among the living. "I've never considered myself a hero," Woody often said. "The heroes are the ones who never came home." His humility masked a deeper torment. Even decades later, Woody wrestled with the moral weight of what he'd done. His weapon didn't just kill, it incinerated. It didn't just eliminate threats, it erased them. And for all the strategic value, it left scars on both the enemy and the operator. Woody never glorified the flamethrower. He respected its necessity, but he mourned its reality. And he wasn't alone. Flamethrower operators from the Pacific War rarely spoke of their role. Many refused to tell their families what they did. Others lived in isolation, consumed by guilt or crushed by trauma. Veterans groups reported disproportionately high rates of alcoholism, depression, and even suicide among former flame troops. It was the weapon that did its job too well. Psychiatrists who studied combat trauma in the post-war years noted that those who used flamethrowers experienced moral injury more deeply than others. They weren't just taking lives. They were extinguishing them in ways that felt unnatural. That memory of flesh and fire, of cave screams echoing through the smoke, stayed locked inside. The military retired the flamethrower in the 1970s. Officially, it was outdated. Unofficially, it was too brutal to justify anymore. But its legacy didn't fade. Not for the men who carried it, not for those who faced it, and not for those who still see it in nightmares. In the decades after Iwo Jima, the world began to look at flamethrowers differently, not as tools of necessity, but as symbols of the darkest edge of war. Nations quietly removed them from their arsenals. Military ethics experts debated whether their use should be considered a war crime. And international treaties began forming around their limitation. In 1980, the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons listed incendiary weapons as subject to restriction. While flamethrowers weren't outright banned, their deployment in civilian areas or against populations became strictly regulated. Even modern militaries, including the United States, began distancing themselves from their use. It wasn't just about effectiveness anymore, it was about conscience. Because at its core, the flamethrower forced a confrontation with what warfare truly was. Not glory, but horror. Not flags and medals, but screams and fire. No other weapon brought soldiers as close to their enemy, or demanded they erase them in such personal, intimate violence. The men of Iwo Jima who carried these weapons didn't ask for them. They weren't monsters. They were Marines, given the only option they had to survive a battlefield designed to kill them. They were sacrificial weapons, human torches sent into the dark, knowing that few, if any, would return. Out of 335 flamethrower operators deployed at Iwo Jima, only 18 came back alive. That's a 92% casualty rate. Most died before they could fire. Others were caught after the flame went out. Those who returned were never the same. But they did what they had to. Because in that volcanic hellscape, there was no other way forward. In the end, Iwo Jima was captured. The flag went up. The war in the Pacific moved closer to Japan. But for those who carried fire on their backs, the victory came at a cost that history rarely talks about. And maybe that's why this story matters, because some weapons leave wounds that never heal, and some men carry burdens that no metal can ever lift.